Here are some quick notes on magnitudes to accompany Chapter 1 of To Build a Star. So there's lots of different ways to talk about how bright a star is. An intrinsic property of the star is the luminosity, so that's the actual amount of light energy emitted from the star, the rate of energy emission in the form of light. And usually when we're talking about luminosity, we're talking about all wavelengths, and so that would really be the bolometric luminosity. But that's of course not what we measure. What we measure is the apparent magnitude. So this is how bright a star is when it's observed from the Earth and it's observed in a given band of wavelength, so some wavelength range. We can then also consider the absolute magnitude. So this is how bright the star would appear from Earth if it were located 10 parsecs away, again in a given band of wavelengths. So it's basically correcting the apparent magnitude for the distance. And when we talk about magnitude, it's important to note that for historical reasons, a larger number is a less bright object. So the more negative the magnitude is, the brighter it is. And as you go to positive numbers and increasingly positive numbers, you are less bright. Again, for historical reasons, 5 units of magnitude, that corresponds to a factor of 100 difference in brightness. So why do we have these 3 different descriptions? Well, luminosity, that's the intrinsic property that's related to stellar structure. That's going to be useful when we're talking about what's really going on in the star. The apparent magnitude, the nice thing there is that's what you actually measure. And then the absolute magnitude, it lets us still work with the idea of magnitude, but it's more related to the luminosity in a given wavelength range. So all 3 of these can be useful. So the apparent magnitude, it is a relative quantity. So the apparent magnitude of object A minus the apparent magnitude of object B is equal to minus 2.5 times log base 10, it's log base 10, of the ratio of the fluxes. It's flux of object A or flux of object B. And really this is over a given wavelength band, and so we're talking about the integral of flux A over a wavelength band divided by the integral of flux B over the same wavelength band. And it's a relative quantity, so the star Vega, that is defined as 0. That is just the definition of magnitude 0 is the brightness that we measure of Vega. And then for just relative quantities here, magnitude spans a large range. So the sun is minus 27. The brightest star in the night sky is Sirius, that's minus 1. The human eye can see down to about magnitude 6. And then the Hubble Space Telescope, what's the dimmest object? It can see somewhere around the low 30s in terms of magnitude. It gets a little bit complicated when you talk about objects that are far away because the magnitude takes not only into account the distance, but also things like dimming because of dust. So this is, in any case, it's roughly 32. So we measure these in a given wavelength range, and this is known as a band. So often we're going to use the letter of the band in place of the letter M there. So as far as different bands go, this is just a handful of the common ones. There are many different photometric bands. We have the ultraviolet, blue, visual, red, and infrared. And you can see they're not perfect rectangles, right? You let in some range of wavelength with different efficiencies, basically. And this just has to do with the style of these filters. That's why they wind up kind of having these different bites. But in any case, you'd place one of these on your telescope, and that's how you'd make photometric observations. And oftentimes you'll observe an object with at least a couple of bands because the difference in the magnitude for 2 different bands, this is going to provide rough spectral information, right? It's going to allow us to infer the surface temperature. So just for instance, if I observe the same object in the blue and in the visual, then you'll get some amount of light in each of these spectra. If it's a very hot star, remember that high temperatures peak at lower wavelengths. A hot star is going to have a lot more blue and a lot less visual. A cooler star, on the other hand, is going to peak at larger wavelengths, and so your V magnitude is going to be larger relative to your B magnitude. And so the difference between the magnitudes in these different band passes, this is going to give you a surface temperature. For instance, we can construct a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram for a group of stars using the magnitudes that we observe. So in this case, we're taking a globular cluster. So what we have is the globular cluster M55. We're plotting the magnitude in the visual band versus the magnitude in the B minus the magnitude in the V. So we take the difference between these two magnitudes, and the hotter stars are going to have more blue. So as you go left here, that's a higher effective temperature. Cooler stars are going to be more red. And then as you get brighter, you're going to have your magnitude number is going to decrease until it finally even becomes negative. You might say, well, wait a second, how does this magnitude correspond directly to the luminosity? Isn't this a relative quantity? It is, but if you take something like a globular cluster like M55, all of these stars are the same distance away. So the apparent magnitude in one band is going to be directly related to your luminosity. Okay, so you can learn something really interesting from these observations. We're going to cover more as the semester goes on, but just briefly, what you see here, this is the main sequence, continues along that diagonal there. So these stars are burning hydrogen in their core and converting it to helium. When that exhausts, you get the main sequence turn off, and you're looking at the red giant branch. So this is shell hydrogen burning, as we'll talk about later. At the peak of the red giant branch, you ignite core helium. That's these guys here. This is called the horizontal branch. You have core helium burning. And then afterwards, when you have shell helium burning and all kinds of fun shell burning, that's the asymptotic giant branch. And then these dudes here, these are known as the blue stragglers. They are located after the main sequence turnoff, and they're believed to be due to binary star interactions as far as I know. And one interesting thing you can learn about this globular cluster is how old it is. So later on in the semester, we'll kind of learn how to map between the mass of a star and its lifetime. And as you increase along this direction in the main sequence, you get to higher mass stars. Higher mass stars have a shorter lifetime. And so if we infer where we're at in the main sequence turnoff, we know how long ago this globular cluster formed. Because typically it's believed all these stars will have formed at around the same time. So that's pretty cool, and that's one reason why you'd care about magnitudes. Just through these observations with two different bands, you can learn a heck of a lot about this globular cluster here. So the absolute magnitude, this is what allows us to correct the apparent magnitude for the distance. So it's basically related to the luminosity, but again, we're focusing on just a given wavelength band. So it is defined as what the apparent magnitude would be if your star were 10 parsecs away, so about 33 light years away. And mathematically, you can figure out by looking at the apparent magnitude definition from before that what you need then is the distance modulus to relate your apparent magnitude to your absolute magnitude. So the apparent magnitude for a given star minus its absolute magnitude, that's equal to the distance modulus, and that is equal to 5 times log base 10 of the distance minus 5, and here your distance is in parsecs. So we can take the stars from the Hipparcos survey. This is all the kind of nearby stars. They have many different distances, so you can't get away with just the apparent magnitude. You need the actual absolute magnitude. You plot that versus the distance, the difference between the absolute magnitude in two different color bands. So this is the blue minus the visual. To be honest, I don't know which one's plotted on the vertical here, but blue minus the visual to give you the color. And again, you're basically plotting temperature increasing to the left and luminosity increasing vertically. And you can see now is your full HR diagram with that full main sequence going on and your giant branch. And then hanging out down here are your white dwarfs, right? These are the carbon-oxygen spheres left over after a relatively low mass star ends its lifetime. And that is it for these quick notes on magnitudes.